Welcome to another episode of Progressive Short Takes. I'm Joe Firestone, your host. We're going to consider the question in this one. Is Nancy Pelosi about to get rolled again? This title is based on a post that appeared on August 21st by Robert Kuttner, entitled, "Will Pelosi Get Rolled on the Relief Bill?" And I'm going to share this with you. So there's a nice picture of Nancy. And there's a nice picture of her hands out in a supplicating gesture. Why she has to be a supplicant, I don't know. Excuse me a second. But there she is, supplicating. And Robert Kuttner says, Speaker Pelosi has called the House back into session Saturday to vote on the Maloney bill that would roll back perverse changes made by Postmaster General DeJoy aimed at sabotaging vote by mail and the Postal Service generally. So far, so good. Then Pelosi added $25 billion in emergency funds for the Postal Service. So Kuttner thinks that may be a misstep in two respects. He says, as my reporting showed, the post office does not need that money until next year. According to its SEC filings, the USPS is sitting on $13 billion in cash, backed by another $10 billion from the original CARES Act as yet unspent. And he concludes the problem is DeJoy's deliberate sabotage, not a scarcity of funds. Now, I'm not entirely clear about that. And the reason why I'm not entirely clear is because, as I understand it, the Treasury Department is currently sitting on the $10 billion for the post office from the original CARES Act, holding it hostage, until DeJoy makes certain business changes in the business model of the post office. So it could be Nancy Pelosi's bill needs to include a provision that $10 billion is to be released immediately to the post office and not to be further held hostage by the Treasury Secretary. Going on, though, so to conclude, the problem may not only be the deliberate sabotage, it may also be a scarcity of funds, a real scarcity of funds. But anyway, the first risk is that the Saturday debate bogs down into an argument over how much money the USPS needs, rather than a need to reverse all of the perverse decisions of its management. The second risk is that the debate over the Postal Service crowds out the even more consequential need to restore and expand public support for continued federal supplemental unemployment aid, which has now expired, as well as emergency aid to state and local governments, and the other urgent elements in the $3.5 trillion HEROES Act, which has been blocked by Trump and the Senate Republicans. Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have already signaled that they would settle for $2 trillion, giving away much of their bargaining position. I completely agree with that. I think Kuttner, is right about that. You do not pre-negotiate. You do not signal you're going to pre-negotiate. If you thought that all the elements in the $3.5 trillion HEROES Act were necessary for recovery, you have to keep saying that again and again and again until you get some movement from the other side. And every time the other side says you're delaying and you're failing to compromise, you go through all of the elements in the HEROES Act, and you have to be prepared to defend them to the public and say, look, you want these stimulus checks, don't you? You want the unemployment relief, don't you? You want the emergency aid to state and local governments to keep the teachers and the firemen employed and the police employed. And you want that for local governments also, so that you don't get another 6 million people who are unemployed, further depressing the economy, making things worse for everybody. In other words, you defend the substance of your original bill. Pelosi's problem in doing this, though, is that about $500 million in that original bill is for lobbyists in Washington to bail them out. She doesn't want to have to get into defending that. That's what this is about. She weakened her negotiating position by putting that into the bill instead of making sure that all of the elements of the bill were truly necessary from the standpoint of the interests of the people. But she has to go into this and she has to say, I'm not compromising this because everything in here is in the interest of the people. And then she has to argue for each element and let the Republicans say on their side, well, how about this $500 billion, which is for bailing out lobby groups in Washington? Why is that in the people's interests? She has to bluff the Republicans and see if the Republicans are going to say that. If they say that, fine, more power to them. Then she's going to have to back off that $500 billion. But if she likes that $500 billion so much, she's probably got a pretty good possibility the Republicans are not going to object because their lobby groups are going to be bailed out too. So let's see if they dare to threaten her. But that's the only thing that I saw in the bill that wasn't important. So let her defend the whole bill. If the Republicans say we can't afford to spend another $2 trillion because another $3.5 trillion because we spent so much before, and the debt is too great, then it's about time that Nancy Pelosi steps forward and say, look, you weren't concerned about the debt when you made the $2 trillion in tax cuts. I'll tell you what, let's take those tax cuts away. Then we'll have enough money for this $3.5 trillion in the HEROES Act. Why did we need those tax cuts? That hasn't helped our economic situation anyway. That's not for the people. Nancy Pelosi's got to fight. She's got to learn how to fight. She doesn't know how to fight. Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have already signaled that they would settle for $2 trillion, giving away much of their bargaining position. Ridiculous, ridiculous. Even before negotiations resume. It's just not possible that Congress can act on both the postal bill and on the larger HEROES Relief Act in one day. So negotiations with the White House and Mitch McConnell have been suspended since August 7th. And of course, it's already the 27th. For 20 days, the Senate has sat on its butt and won't do anything. It's been suspended. The White House and the Senate sat on their butts. Nancy Pelosi has to say she's ready to come back to the table. She's ready to talk to them, but they have to come back to the table right now. And by the way, she's also got to say, my coming back to the table doesn't mean that I'm giving away anything. Let the Republicans and let the president find stuff in this bill that's not essential. Then we can talk about giving away some of the $3.5 trillion. But until then, we're not going to give it away. That's what she's got to say. So, to go on with the article, unless Pelosi intends to keep the House in session longer, The risk is that Republicans will make some kind of compromise on the Postal Service, but providing money, a pittance, of course, but not all of the management safeguards, and Congress will go home without acting on the HEROES Act or, by the way, safeguarding the election for the rest of us. Yeah, that's the risk, but the risk is only there because Pelosi doesn't know how to negotiate, and because she delights in caving to the Republicans at every opportunity. Well, Shahed Buttar is going to have something to say about that in his race against her in her district in San Francisco. Because if she is not able to negotiate, there are other people in the Democratic Party who can negotiate. People like Ro Khanna, for example. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. People like Pramila Jayapal. They will be able to negotiate if she can't. And once again, Trump is crazy like a fox, says Kuttner. He emulates another great dictator, Chairman Mao, who famously said, quote, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, unquote. I don't know if I would label him a great a dictator, maybe just a dictator. Maybe Chairman Mao was a great dictator, but I don't know that Chairman Trump is a great dictator. Anyway, by creating an entirely artificial crisis at the Postal Service and then partly walking it back, Trump diverts attention from all the other urgently needed parts of coronavirus relief and sets up giving the Democrats half a victory that at best merely restores the status quo, leaves over 30 million workers without any relief, and leaves both parties looking like they should share the blame. Democrats coming off a triumphant virtual convention have to do better than that. Specifically, Pelosi and Schumer have to do better than that. They have to draw the line and they have to argue for what they put forward. They have to argue for what they put forward and say that is necessary. And if the Republicans propose other things in response to this, they have to propose other things in response to the Republicans. Like they ought to keep in their back pocket the Automatic Boost to Communities Act and force that on the Republicans. And while they're doing it, leak it to the public at the same time. Leak it. Leak it. Leak it. That's how you negotiate. The other side didn't want to accept $2,000 a month basic income for everybody in America as long as COVID lasts, with $1,000 for each child. They didn't want to accept that for you. Something that wasn't even going to create further debt because it was going to be funded by platinum coins. What the hell are they doing? This is all their fault. They've botched up COVID. They're botching up the economic recovery. They're botching up the policy response. They deserve to be immediately voted out of office. The Senate needs to be taken away, and Trump needs to lose this election by 400 electoral votes to whatever is left. Democrats have to do better than Nancy Pelosi can do. I'm afraid. I don't have any confidence in her at all to do a good job on this. She botched up the negotiations in the first place when she agreed to give them most of what they wanted in the CARES Act, specifically the $4.6 trillion slush fund at the Fed for the big corporations. That's what they really wanted. That's all they really cared about. And she let them have that without making sure that the public was secure through the duration of the COVID crisis. That's what Nancy Pelosi did. That's what she did. Well, that's it for this edition of Progressive Short Takes. I am going to show you my Progressive Short Takes screen again. Oops, I guess I no longer have it up. Let me see if I can quickly find it. No, sorry, I don't know exactly where it's gone. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? There she goes. Okay, there it is. So, I didn't want to share this again, and because I wanted to remind you of my Patreon account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Okay, thanks very much for coming. I'll see you with another progressive short take soon. Good night.